A couple people asked me to make some more instructional videos with examples of how to price old books. So if you have not seen the first one I made on that subject, I will put that at the end of the video. Now I have two books here that I just purchased from someone, so they're nice and fresh. And I will go through some of the pricing databases online, some of the bibliographical databases, as well as, of course, share with you my inner thoughts about pricing. So if you can do one of those Vulcan mind melds, just put your fingers to the screen and you do not have to watch the rest of the video. Pricing is, of course, not just about finding the record online. There is naturally some subtle understanding of that record as well as of the market itself, and it requires an examination, appreciation for the particular volume that you have in your hand. Because you may notice something about that volume, or you may notice something that was not previously described by bibliographers. That you want to draw attention to, and which may make the book more valuable. And in that case, of course, like Arthur O'Shaughnessy or Willy Wonka said, we are the music makers, then we are the market makers in that case. We've all seen as well this week the democratization of information, how dangerous that can be. If you've seen GameStop or Game Stonkers nearly took down the entire financial market. And I'm sure that booksellers, like hedge funds, would like to remain the guardians of the pricing galaxy. So perhaps the information I'm about to give to you is dangerous. In fact, the fate of all humanity may rest upon the ignorance of the masses. But I'm going to do it anyway, and we shall see if the world survives tomorrow after I discuss these two books. Let's start with book number 1, Supplemental Exercises or Christian's Employment, printed by Jabez Earl in Boston in 1729. First as an aside, Jabez. Why is that not a more popular baby's name? Makes an appearance in Sherlock Holmes, and it does mean something like born into suffering. But forget that. I think it's coming back. It's a super cool name. So if you are a future parent, consider Jabez. It's going to be very popular, and you heard it here first. Jabez Earl was actually a Presbyterian English minister, and his works were extremely popular in the early colonial period. And I've had some of them before, and what's interesting is they were almost invariably owned and inscribed by women, including this copy, which says on the rear board here, Anne Turner, her book given to her by her mother. So if you are interested in women's reading interests or their readership in the early colonial period, this is a fine example of that. The second thing I like about the book is the binding, what we call a scale board, American binding. And the word scale board just refers to, instead of soaring through the wood, sort of pulled off. And it makes these very economical, charming little books. So nice early American binding. This is printed in Boston in the 1720s. That's sort of remarkable. Boston was a little bit of a backwater then, maybe had 10,000 people. And when I think of the period, the only thing that even pops to mind is the famous 1721 smallpox epidemic in Boston. And they fought, of course, over the first time they ever used inoculation in this country. And many of the arguments draw some interesting historical parallels, I'm sure, to what's going on with COVID today and the vaccines. But it's amazing that you can hold in your hand a book that was printed in Boston in the 1720s and hopefully one not covered by smallpox. Yeah. The most interesting thing, however, is to me the printer. It says reprinted by Daniel Henchman. I've had Henchman imprints before, and I've talked about in the last video, Rare Books and Rabbit Holes, ghost printings, books that were never printed, of which there is a record, or books that just did not survive in any copies. And Daniel Henchman is responsible for one of the most famous ghost printings in American printing history, perhaps the first Bible ever printed in this country. Generally, the first American Bible is considered to be the famous Aiken Bible of 1782, the Bible of the Revolution, as lauded by the Continental Congress and George Washington. And there was indeed a prohibition on the printing of Bibles in this country because the English granted monopolies to royal printers. But there is mention by Isaiah Thomas, the famous American printer, in his History of American Printing, which was published in 1810, so 60 years later, of a purported Bible printed by Daniel Henchman. Now that is always very exciting to me as a ghost printing, because if anyone actually discovered a copy of that lost first American Bible, it would of course be worth a fortune and a great bibliographical coup, so that is a treasure hunt. I did print up here something from Isaiah Thomas. It's actually an article on America's First Bibles by Randolph Adams, taken from the Colophon in 1935. And if you want to read it, I'll put the link below. And he is discussing Daniel Henchman and this Bible that was printed supposedly in quarto. And Isaiah Thomas says, "This was the first Bible printed in the English language in America. It was carried through the press as privately as possible. And it had the London imprint of Mark Basket, printed to the King's Most Excellent Majesty." So you would have to look for a Mark Basket book that was printed in London, but really printed in America. And he says here, Thomas, "When I was an apprentice, I often heard those who assisted at the case and press in printing this Bible make mention of the fact, as it has a London imprint at this day, it can be distinguished from an early edition of the same date only by those who are acquainted with the niceties of typography." So that would be some fine, but anytime, like I said, I see a Henchman imprint, I'm reminded of that, so I always like them. So now we understand the book and its historical context. Let's go look at some of the pricing in the databases. So now we're going to go about searching some of the databases, and as I've said before, one of the first databases I search is Worldcat. It's not the best database, but it's certainly available to the public, and it gives some indication of institutional ownership, and it also importantly gives the collation or the page counts for a lot of works. You can check if your work is complete, which is absolutely essential. So if I type in here, Jabez Earl, 1729 in Boston as keywords, right away the record will pop up and we can see some of the libraries that own it. And in the notes here at the bottom, we can see the page count, and actually it's supposed to go to page 92. Sadly, our book ends on page 80, so it is lacking 12 pages towards the end, which is often a very serious fatal flaw. It's also lacking a small portion of the title page at the top there, which does not help. Next, I recommend checking a site called Rare Book Hub, which I've pulled up here. Rare Book Hub is an absolutely essential tool these days for booksellers. And if I type in Jabez Earl and Boston, we'll look at early Boston imprints and we pull them all up. We shall see that there are a number of copies sold infrequently, so it's scarce in commerce, but there was a copy printed in 1756 So after the date of our copy, that sold for only $98 at auction in 2016. So that is not a good omen there. The last copy of ours, 1729, was offered in 2007, if we open up that record, at Christie's for $1,800 to $2,500, but it did not sell. And of course, that was complete. And as I said, our copy, unfortunately, is seriously defective. The next thing I like to do is to look to see what books are on the marketplace. So I always go to Via Libri, and I can see if other books are being sold. So I have Jabez Earl Boston typed in here because I just searched that. And if I look through, there is a copy here, and it's the only copy actually of the period of an edition printed in 1725 and offered by a very well-known bookseller in the Netherlands for $1,820. So that is actually a slightly earlier edition than we have, and it is complete. So even if our copy was complete, it probably would have to be priced reasonably less than $1,820 as a slightly later edition. I would point out, however, that the edition being offered does not have the provenance of a woman in it, and I find that very interesting. As I said, I found that in several other copies in terms of women's readership of the period. So I think that is a plus for the copy here. So taking all of this information into account, of course, and again, this is an example of an early American book printed in the 1720s with a woman's provenance, and the often overlooked interesting part of the printer's history, Daniel Henchman, with respect to that ghost printing of the Bible. But I would say that the book is probably only worth being defective perhaps $300. So unfortunately, that is less than the price of a single share of GameStop today. I don't know about tomorrow, but certainly today. So this is the second book I wanted to talk about, which are the Memoirs of Marie Antoinette. It says printed in Paris, but actually translated and reprinted in the United States in 1794. So it does not say the printer. It was actually probably printed in New York and surreptitiously printed. You might perhaps understand why. The trial of Marie Antoinette was in October of 1793, and she was accused of all sorts of horrid and licentious behavior, including orgies at Versailles and incest. So the printer probably did not want his name associated with reprinting some of those. He actually makes mention here of that very thing in the translator's preface. In rather florid but wonderful language, he says, "Such were the depraved morals of this extraordinary woman that her warmest panegyrists have scarce pointed out in her character a single virtue to snatch her memory from unmingled detestation." So you might also understand its interesting book in terms of the perception of Marie Antoinette and in general the French Revolution in America in the 1790s. Of course, many people still had strong affections for the French. They were pivotal in helping during the American Revolution. But this was leading up into the late 1790s when we had, the famous XYZ affair. So there were people on both sides of the political aisle with respect to the French. And this particular work was actually also printed with some of those for political purposes. And he makes note here, again in the preface, he says, he printed this to render ineffectual some of the vile artifices which are insidiously practiced among us in order to alienate our affections from regenerated France, a nation equally virtuous and brave. So he was clearly pro-France, the printer for this. A previous owner has written his name here, Bennett, and it says he paid 2 coppers for the work. That's sort of interesting because the penny, for the first time in America, was only minted in 1793, 1 year before this book was printed, and he paid 2 pennies. If you're in numismatic circles, some of those pennies, large cents, depending on their the rarity of their variety, can get $1.5 million. So I don't know if he made a wise investment in trading 2 of those rare coppers for this book, but we haven't valued it yet, so let's see. The book is also interesting for the engravings. I particularly love the history of early American engravings and woodcut art. This book has 2 wood engravings in it. The one at the back, actually, I think is quite charming, and in fact, it reminds me, and maybe I'll put them side by side in the video, of Paul Revere's famous print of the Boston Massacre, a copy of which just sold the other day, I think, for $450,000. So that's one of the most desirable American prints. This one is more modest, I am sure of that. What I love, however, about the book most is the binding. In fact, the binding is completely hidden. It's been covered over by a single piece of late 18th century marbled paper, almost like a proto-dust jacket. Now, dust jackets themselves, I think the earliest one in the literature probably comes from about the 1830s. But any dust jackets from the 19th century, because they were very fragile, are extremely rare, and there's lots of interesting literature on the history and development and purpose of early dust jackets. This book really fits more into what some booksellers have called vernacular bindings, and a shout out to Garrett Scott there, a great American bookseller. I love the way this has been covered. Sometimes I encounter bindings like this covered by simple paper wraps, brown paper, but finding one in marbled wraps is particularly charming. And the binding underneath, of course, has been preserved in absolutely immaculate condition because of the wrap on it. So that is the book itself. So now let's go look at pricing the book and some of the databases. So now I'm going to be looking at this second work here, and this is the Memoirs of Marie Antoinette, and I'm going to go valuing it in the exact same order I did before. First, by checking Worldcat, and if I search Worldcat here, which I pulled up already, the Memoirs of Marie Antoinette, 1794, immediately at the bottom I get the description, the page count of the work. And again, unfortunately, and this is often a problem in old books and why we have to be careful in checking them before we purchase them, it should end on page 69, and our copy ends on 68. So we are lacking the terminal leaf in the book here, which is never good. Then I go to Rare Book Hub, and I've pulled up to be efficient. It is a very rare work in commerce. No copies of this have appeared before 1964, when one was offered by Goodspeeds. So it's nice to see that it is quite rare in terms of finding the work itself. Again, I think it could be a valuable work, but unfortunately it is, as I said, lacking a page at the back, and for collectors and for dealers, that really is a fatal flaw in terms of selling it and value many times. But going back to the bookbinding, and that really is the redeeming quality of the work, which I think makes up for the lost page, the charming vernacular binding that's in with that marbled wrap around the entire book. And that type of book wasn't really even appreciated 10, 15 years ago. And more today in the marketplace, people are looking for books with interesting bindings or stories to tell. So because of that, I do think it's a more valuable book than the record perhaps indicates. I don't think it's worth a fortune by any means, but I certainly think it would be worth something of $450 or something on that order. So those are my two valuations of the books, and I hope that you enjoyed them and will go out, find books, check the databases. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to write or contact me. And of course, please subscribe to the videos so I will be happy to share in the future more insights and fun things about the rare book and antiquarian trade. Thank you.